Okay, hello everyone, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's IAS Distinguished Lecture. It's part of a new series in the medical humanities that we are organizing here at UST. Today we have the great honor of having with us Professor Marcia INHORN, one of the world's leading medical anthropologists. Professor INHORN is the William K. Landman Jr. Professor of Anthropology and International Affairs at Yale, where she also serves as chair of the Council on Middle East Studies. She's a specialist in gender and reproductive health. She has a very long history of research in the Middle East, in Egypt, Lebanon, and UAE, and Arab America as well. She also has a very long and illustrious CV with more than 20 books on record. Perhaps one of the most well-known is the award-winning The New Arab Man, Emerging Masculinities, Technologies, and Islam in the Middle East, published in 2012, where she looked at, among other things, at changing notions of masculinities and through the lens of male infertility and reproductive technologies. In the latest book, which she will talk about today, she extends these threads of research, focusing primarily on the United States and on a newer reproductive technology, that of egg freezing, which is becoming increasingly popular and is raising a new host of fascinating ethical and anthropological questions. So the book in question is Motherhood on Ice, The Mating Gap and Why Women Freeze Their Eggs, published 2023 from NYU Press. I've just read it. It's a wonderful book, a great ethnography that illustrates all the factors behind the growing use of this biotechnology. Before giving the floor to the speaker, I would like to note that we are starting this new series because we are planning to establish a new minor here at UST on health, medicine, and society, maybe in 2-3 years, and we're making that coincide with the opening of the medical school here at UST. And this is the very first lecture. So please join me in welcoming Professor Marcia INHORN.
Oops. Oh, thank you. Okay, no problem. There we go. Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Julio Ungaro, for inviting me here to Hong Kong Science and Technology University. It's my first time in Hong Kong, and I'm really pleased to be here at the Institute for Advanced Study. And especially this new program in health, medicine, and society is exactly the kind of thing that I've dedicated my own career to. So I'm really pleased that you'll be having a new medical school at this university and also a kind of major that goes along and looks at the social sciences and humanities aspects of health. So yeah, this is the actual physical book. I brought it along, but it was published in 2023 by NYU Press under this title, Motherhood on Ice. And it's about this technology, oocyte cryopreservation through vitrification. Oocyte is egg, cryopreservation is freezing, and vitrification is a new form of cryopreservation which involves fast or flash freezing at very cold temperatures. And why is that important for eggs? The human egg is the largest cell in the human body, and it's watery. And it's when frozen, they were trying to freeze eggs for a very, very long time, but it would crystallize, and when you tried to rewarm, it would fragment and basically make a non-viable entity. And so it was really hard for reproductive scientists to figure out how to freeze human eggs. Cryopreservation of sperm has been going on for a very long time, since the 1960s. Embryo freezing has been possible since the early 1980s, right after the birth of Louise Brown, the world's first test tube baby. She was born in England in 1978. They figured out, actually in Australia, how to freeze human embryos in IVF. But egg freezing was difficult, and it's really only been in the new millennium, in the aughts, that experimentation, actually in Japan, was really the forerunner of vitrification for eggs. And to be really clear, when women freeze their eggs, let's say a 30-year-old woman freezes her eggs, and she leaves them in storage for a decade and goes back at age 40, the eggs she will retrieve are biologically her 30-year-old eggs. They're her younger eggs frozen in time. And we really realize in reproductive sciences that it's the egg which is the most crucial thing in terms of reproduction. Egg age matters. Womb age, not so much. Actually, postmenopausal women can be actually stimulated to be able to carry a baby after menopause, but eggs cannot. Eggs have a time limit on them, and we're going to talk about that. So there has been now more than a decade of egg freezing, which we'll just call EF. In the U.S., the experimental label was lifted by the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, or ASRM, on October 19th, 2012, and almost immediately there was demand in the U.S. for egg freezing. In the very first year, 2013, there were 7,600 egg freezing cycles performed. It almost doubled by 2018, 5 years on. By 2022, it more than doubled in the U.S., and it's estimated that in the sort of first year, from 2009 to 2021, almost 100,000 egg freezing cycles have been performed in the U.S. And in the time of COVID, 2020 and 2021, there was a huge demand, a 31% increase in demand for egg freezing because we were locked in our apartments and homes. Women were not going out, meeting, mating, dating. And so women, clinics stayed open, and many women went during that period of time, so that there's been a 400% increase in the first decade of egg freezing in the U.S. It's been an exploding technology in terms of demand. But it's really costly, and it's an uncertain technology. All assisted reproductive technologies are expensive. To do one cycle of egg freezing in the U.S., it's between $10,000 and $20,000. Because there are also very expensive hormonal medications that women have to use in this technology, and they're expensive. So on average, it's about $15,000 or $16,000 to do one cycle of egg freezing. And then storing the eggs is costly too. It can range between $500 and $1,500 a year to store the eggs. So if you were going to store for 10 years, you could end up spending $15,000 on the storage. To go back and use your eggs, they have to be rewarmed, they have to be fertilized. It's basically the second half of an IVF cycle, about $6,000. And so from start to finish, a woman could spend $30,000 to freeze and use her eggs. And sadly, a lot of women have to do multiple cycles because they are told that they should try to freeze somewhere between 15 and ideally about 20 eggs. And that's hard for a lot of women. A lot of women do not get that on a single cycle. And even if you do freeze 20 eggs, it doesn't mean that you're going to get a take-home baby out of this, because sometimes eggs don't freeze well, sometimes they don't thaw well, and sometimes embryos are made, but they're not viable. And so we feel that there's a lot of false advertising in all of the ARTs, and truthful advertising would really tell women, freeze your eggs, but if you're doing it at the age of 38 or above, it's really unlikely to lead to a pregnancy. So we're going to talk about why time really matters for women. Egg freezing also requires bravery. I mean, it is a very invasive and intense thing to do. It takes about a month of a woman's life. Once she starts, there are daily clinic visits. There are a lot of ultrasounds as they're looking at the sort of expansion of the number of eggs in women's ovaries. Women have to learn, especially if they don't have a partner in life, they have to learn to self-inject these hormonal medications, mostly into the belly fat. But there's one really large shot called a trigger shot. It has to go into the buttocks, and it's very hard to do that on your own. And 20% of people have needle phobia. So there were many women that I talked to who said, I'm terrified of needles. For me, it was almost a red line. I almost didn't do it, but I did it, and I am so proud of myself because I did my self-injections. On the day when they take the eggs out, retrieve them from a woman's ovaries, it is a transvaginal surgery. It's through the vagina. It's under sedation. And because a woman is anesthetized, she has to have somebody to accompany her home, which can be difficult, to find a friend willing to take a day off work or whatever. A lot of women had their moms come from across country to be with them. After the eggs are retrieved and a woman's sent home, she usually feels uncomfortable, bloated, maybe nauseous, and there is the potential for something serious called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, or OHSS, where a fluid begins to build up in the abdomen, and it can become so distended that it presses on the lungs, and women have to be hospitalized and have this fluid drained. It doesn't happen often, but it is a serious complication. In terms of patient-centeredness, women did not experience egg freezing as patient-centered. The clinics, they have to go to IVF clinics, which are places where married couples are trying to overcome their infertility. They're busy places, they're overcrowded, women have to line up to go get the monitoring done. Women said, I felt like a cow in a factory on the way to slaughter, or I felt like a chicken, in some sort of assembly line. It was often, there were lots of suggestions on how this process could be made more women-centered. It wasn't a pleasant experience for most women. And so at the end of the day, I really want to say it takes an amount of bravery or courage to do egg freezing. Some women said to me after it was done, I felt like a badass because I injected myself, I got through it, it was really uncomfortable, but I got 17 eggs and I feel really happy. So, but happy at the end of a very difficult month. Given the expense and, the sort of embodiment of egg freezing, the question is why? Why are so many women turning to egg freezing? And the big question, it was actually the initial hypothesis in my proposal for this study. Is it because women are intentionally deferring, delaying, and postponing having children? Those are the three verbs that are used over and over and over in the clinical literature and in media. Oh, women want to postpone childbearing. And why? Presumably, it's for their educations and for career planning. That's the term used over and over. Oh, this is for career planning, for ambitious women trying to plan their careers. And this language of planning was actually picked up by the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. They issued a very important document 5 years after the start of egg freezing in the US, and they said we should be calling egg freezing planned oocyte cryopreservation. Like women are doing this in a very planful and intentional manner, it should be considered to be part of family planning. So that was their perspective. For me, I thought, well, we really need to know what women say. Like, why are women going to freeze their eggs? That's what an anthropologist can find out. And so I basically did a large scale, it's really the largest ethnographic study that's been conducted on egg freezing. It was funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation, which, by the way, President Trump is trying to take away, the U.S. National Science Foundation. It was both the cultural anthropology and science and society programs. And I basically sent out flyers in clinics, in 4 clinics. 2 of them were academic clinics and 2 of them were private, large-scale private clinics. And women volunteered. There was no coercion, but they wrote back to me if they were interested in talking to me about their egg freezing. And everybody in my study of these 150 women, they were the ones who had already undertaken at least one egg freezing cycle. I also talked to a few other women who were doing it or planning to do it or decided not to do it. But my book really focuses on 150 women. 36 of them did so-called medical egg freezing, and that is a different population of women. Sadly, young women, usually with cancer diagnoses. And this is really why egg freezing was initially developed for young women who, in going through chemotherapy, it jeopardizes a woman's ovarian function. People can be sterilized by cancer treatment. And so the idea was if we could freeze these young cancer patients' eggs before they go into treatment, it would give them a chance to become future parents once they survive the cancer. So that's a different story, and I'm happy to talk about it. But this book, Motherhood on Ice, is really about the elective or non-medical egg freezing population, which around the world is the major population for this technology. And I ended up doing very in-depth ethnographic interviews with these women, sometimes taking 2-3 hours, where women just shared their egg freezing stories. Every woman had a story to give about why she was doing this. And I'm going to share some of those stories today. Just who are these women? What's the demographic? For America, these things matter. It was a diverse population of women, mostly white, about 2/3. Interestingly, Asian Americans are only 5.5% of the US population, but they were 18% of the egg freezing population, for reasons we can discuss. There were Black, Latina, mixed race, and some women of Middle Eastern heritage. So it was not all white people. There was a New York Times editorial saying, oh, egg freezing is only going to be for white women. And that is not true. It is a diverse population doing this. The women in my study were professional urban women, almost 60% lived on the East Coast, from Boston down to Washington, D.C. But I was very interested in tech, women in California, in the tech world. And so I did interview almost 20% of women came from the Bay Area, Silicon Valley. And then a quarter of the women were from other big cities like Chicago, Seattle, Austin, Texas. Education is very important. This was a highly educated group of women. Only 20%, 1/5, had stopped at the bachelor's level, and 80% had gone on for master's degrees. About half of the women had master's degrees. Then there were MDs, JDs, PhDs, MD, PhDs, many people who were MD, JD, JD, MPH. It was a very educated group of women. And because they were so educated, they were successful professional women. And they were in 10 sort of broad fields. Interestingly, the number one category was women in healthcare, including quite a few physicians, nurses, public health people. But I also interviewed a lot of women in Washington, D.C. who were working in government. There were women who owned their own businesses, communications, law, art, and there were some professors in this group. And because they already were well established in their careers, most were high earning. I didn't ask everyone what their salaries were, but when they told me what their salaries were, these were women in what you would call the top 10%, the top percentile of American earners. They were making well over 6 figures, most of them. And because of that, 90% of the women in the study were able to pay for their own egg freezing, even though some of them had to do multiple cycles and were spending up to $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. They were often very proud of the fact that they hadn't had to borrow money, or parents often offered to help out and they didn't have to use their parents' money. But also clinics are aware that some women can't pay, and they're trying to make certain plans and sort of discounts for women. The payment issue is big. I highlight in blue late 30-something because this is when women were doing it in my study. And around the world, this is the same thing. Women are coming in their late 30s to egg freezing. In my study, the average age at first egg freezing was 36.6 years of age. These are women who are almost 37 years old when they did it. And why is that important? Because of this thing, the so-called fertility cliff. Women's fertility is in red, men's fertility is in blue. Most women in their 20s have very stable fertility. Most women will not have a problem with infertility. They will have perfectly fine fertility. But when you get into your early 30s, your ovarian reserve, the quantity and quality of eggs begins to decline slightly around age 32. And then there's a big dip, a significant decline around age 37, which has been called the fertility cliff. Women by that age, their fertility is much less than it was before. And so when a woman reaches the age of 40, she has a 5% chance of conceiving. Women in their 40s, it's the end of the reproductive lifespan. And what I learned is that women in America do not understand this. They did not know anything about the fertility cliff. I ended up calling it fertility benightedness because women said, I felt so in the dark about my fertility and about this thing called age-related fertility decline. Why didn't I know anything about this? So I asked women, well, why do you think you didn't know anything about this? And there were 3 big answers. First of all, in America, in only certain states in America, do students get sex education. And when they do, it's all about prevention of pregnancy, about contraception and how to prevent sexually transmitted infections. They don't talk about if you wanted to have a child, when would be a good time to start thinking about that. It is not fertility education, it's sex education. And then these women in America, I learned that most of these women had been put on contraception, usually hormonal contraceptives, in their late teens, not usually to prevent pregnancy, but to get a regular period, to help with acne. It's very routine now for women to be put on the pill early on, and then they stay on it sort of forever, and their OBGYNs ask every year at the annual visit, oh, let's up your contraception. Let's get you a new prescription of contraception, without asking, Would you like to go off your contraception? Would you like to have children? So a lot of these women said, I've been such a good patient. I went every year. I like my gynecologist, but she never asked me. She never said a word about, should I go off contraception? So they felt that they weren't getting this information from their doctors. And then in America, in celebrity culture, which is a big thing in America, there's so many celebrity women who seem to be having babies when they're 48, 49, 52 years of age, and they are not disclosing that they are not using their own eggs. They are using donor egg, but they don't talk about it. So there's a big impression, even among physicians in the US, that it is easy to get pregnant in your 40s. And so women are completely benighted about the reality of the fertility decline. But the big issue that I discovered in my study, and this is the thing we're going to talk about today, is what we could call the men as partners problem. This is not my term. It's a term used in international public health. It's usually applied to men in the global south to talk about how men need to step it up and be good partners to their wives and take care of their children. But I want to argue that men in the global north, in America at least, are not partnering well with women. What I discovered in my study was that these women were heterosexual. They wanted to be in a partnership. They were already in their late 30s, but they were single. They were single, single, single. 82% of women were single at the time they did their egg freezing, either because they were just single, they hadn't had a partner for a while, and then there were women who were in relationships. They might have been married or engaged, but the relationship had ended. So this was the big story. It is something that women are doing when they don't have a partner. There were 18% of the total study, 9% of these women who were partnered, and 9% of women did their egg freezing within a relationship, but they told me they felt the relationship was unstable, either because it was too new, they didn't know where it was headed, or it was already a rocky relationship, or in America we talk about polyamory, guys who have multiple committed relationships, multiple partners. And then there were men who were in the relationship but were just adamantly refusing to have kids, the refusers. There were 9% of women in the total who felt that they were in a stable relationship with a man, but why were they freezing their eggs? Because the partner was unready or unwilling to have kids now. So this issue of unreadiness, men who are unready to parent. So I wasn't expecting this. I had no idea, but this was the main finding. Egg freezing is not being done by career women. And by the way, in America, we don't have the term career men, right? Career women, these ambitious, single-minded women. So it's not being done by career women to postpone their fertility. Rather, educated professional women are attempting to preserve and extend their fertility at the end of their reproductive lifespans because they cannot find a stable, committed reproductive partner, even though that's what they want. So these were women who really wanted to be partnered and were having a hard time finding this thing. And so for me, I was astounded. I really didn't expect this. In sociological theory, there's this thing called grounded theory, and theoretical saturation. You're supposed to talk to people, and when you start getting repetition, you're onto something, and it happens after you interview a lot of people. For me, I at about 10 women, interviewing about 10 women of the total, I already knew what the theoretical saturation was. Why are so many highly educated women, partnerless? That was the problem. They were partnerless. And this was a typical example, a story from, I call her Aziza. She was an academic physician. She was in an elite East Coast medical institution. She had 2 super subspecialties, and she had a boyfriend in her medical residency, but he insulted her, he called her ugly, and he said he was better than she was, and he dumped her for a nurse. And she ended up not having a boyfriend after that. She went on with her career, but she was single. And this is what she said to me. If I found a man, I'd move to Alaska. That's considered very far away. But most men don't want relationships. They just want to meet and date. And most women won't go out with the less educated check stand dude, but men will date an uneducated woman. So I think I have about a 0.09% chance of meeting someone. And meanwhile, I was feeling like, OMG, my biological clock. It's ticking, it's ticking, it's ticking, it's ticking, you know? So even though I'm 1,000% happy I did it, the egg freezing, it felt somewhat like a defeat. I felt like I gave up because I couldn't find a man. And so my interviews were full of these kinds of stories, and I ended up sort of identifying three what I would call gender laments, sort of three themes in the things that women were telling me. The first was about their own self-blame, blaming themselves and doubting themselves, which is very unfortunate. And then women talked about the fact that in the young generation of women, there are higher expectations for partnership, whereas they believe that men have lower commitments to partnership. And so just to say a little bit more, the one that Aziza really was typical of this. She's, you know, I have a whole back and forth between me and her in my book, where she's like, well, you know, I'm ugly. And she wasn't ugly. And it was like, you're not ugly. Oh, well, I'm not attractive. It's like, excuse me, you are attractive. But she was just sort of down on herself about why she didn't have a boyfriend or a partner. And, you know, women called it the eternal mystery. How did I end up this way? I didn't expect to be 35 years old with no partner in life. I always thought I'd be a mother with 3 children by this time. So they'd say, well, maybe I'm too picky. Maybe my standards are simply too high. Or ageism. Oh, at this point, I'm too old to get a guy. Nobody wants a woman age 37. Aziza, I'm not attractive enough. I didn't put enough attention on my appearance. Or maybe I'm not attracted to the right kind of man. Women often were like, well, I had this college boyfriend. I wasn't in love with him, but maybe I should have married him. Maybe I'm going for the wrong kind of guy. And then there was so much discussion about the energy of meeting and mating and dating. Everybody had been on dating apps, and I learned about maybe 10 to 12 different kinds of dating apps. Some women were even going to old-fashioned matchmakers trying to figure it out, but they found it exhausting, fruitless, torture. There were many words to describe dating and the energy one had to put into it. But on a more of a gender level, women talked about changing gender expectations, and they felt that maybe women had higher expectations than in their parents' generation. And women said, you know, we were raised, you know, to have it all. We want to be in egalitarian relationships at work, where we work, and at home. We're looking for gender equality in a partnership, and it's very important to me. And then they said, well, you know, maybe because of that, women are becoming more selective in choosing mates and don't want to settle for less. And the term that women used over and over is, I don't want to settle. I've seen friends who married because they were, you know, anxious, and they settled for someone that didn't really meet their needs. It's been a bad marriage. I don't want to do that. I'm not desperate, and I don't want to settle. What do I want? I want a soulmate, somebody who's similar to me, you know, same sort of background, who understands that I love my work, who wants to support me, who wants to have children with me. I want this equal person that I'm not settling for. And in anthropology, we have these two old-fashioned terms, but they seem to apply here. Hypogamy, which is marrying down, and hypergamy, which is marrying up. Typically, traditionally around the world, and this probably pertains to Hong Kong, we can talk about it, women are traditionally supposed to engage in hypergamy, marrying up. A man who's slightly older, maybe more education, maybe settled into a better job. Maybe he can be the breadwinner and support the woman and children if she decides not to work. She's supposed to marry up, and men are supposed to marry down, hypogamy. They're supposed to find somebody who's maybe younger and fertile, somebody who maybe isn't as educated, maybe doesn't have the same level of job as they do. So we've got these around the world very traditional, I'm going to say retrogressive gender norms that really aren't working for women anymore, because women are not being socialized to marry down below their education and class level. But if they think about going up, they're already at the top level. There's sort of a glass ceiling. There's nobody to marry up to. And even trying to find an equal man has proved to be very difficult for this population of women. So they have a very limited range of options, as you'll see. I didn't interview any men in my study. Somebody else is going to have to do that study. But women, through their eyes, felt that men have lower commitments to the whole partnership and parenting agenda. And they said, look, men aren't raised like women. They're not raised to want an egalitarian partnership. They're still being socialized to marry down. Somebody younger, a trophy wife, they had all of these things to say about that. And women used the I word over and over and over. They called it the I word, intimidation. They said men are intimidated by women who are high achieving, and men can't fathom marrying up to a more educated woman, somebody who's got a better salary. And there were many stories about this. Women gave me many examples, like, I've probably gone out on 100 dates in Washington, D.C. None of the men have as much education as I do. I'm a PhD. And they ask me where I work. I tell them I work at NASA, the National Science, Space Association. And the men will go, you're smarter than I am. No way can we see each other again. Or a woman will invite a man over to her condo. She's bought a lovely condo. She has her car parked outside. The man comes in, sees the car, sees the condo. That's the last time he'll ever see her because he's not at the same level as she is. And then there was this thing I heard about from California women. I'd never heard this term before, but they talked a lot about the men who delay commitment because they never want to grow up, the Peter Pans of the world. Like Peter Pan, these could be men who are educated and have money, but they want to play. They want to go out to nice dinners, and they want to wine and dine, and they want to go skiing, and they want to go on a boat, and they want to have fun with you. But they are playing. They don't want to grow up. They're having fun in their lives, and they have no intention of partnering with you and, having kids. And the prologue to my book is about a California woman I call Kayla, and she ran into this over and over in California to the point where the man who went with her to egg freeze, he was very supportive of her egg freezing. And then she realized as the weeks after the egg freezing went on, that he had no intention of settling with her and using the eggs with her. He just helped her through the egg freezing. It was very demoralizing for her. Then, this generation of egg freezing women are the first generation where their parents divorced. In America, law changed and people started getting divorced. And so a lot of these women were from that generation where parents divorced in America. And they felt that a lot of men who had seen their moms and dads go through divorce felt that their moms had been traumatized by the divorce, and they themselves as men didn't want to traumatize a woman. They were really reluctant to marry because they had seen the bitter split up of their own parents. And so they didn't want to put a woman through that. But a lot of women said, look at, men today just aren't into the partnership and marriage and kids thing anymore. It's different from our dad's generation. Our dads would have never thought about not marrying and having kids. But men today do. They want to be single at heart. They have other things they like to do. They've got their male friends. They've got hobbies. They like to travel. They like their lives single, and they don't intend to partner and settle down. And this went along with the feeling that a lot of men are just simply reluctant to become fathers, this issue of the unreadiness or the unwilling man. And actually, the Pew Research Center, which is a major survey center in America, has documented the fact that younger generation men and women are saying that they don't necessarily want to have children, and it's because of the economy is bad and climate change. So something to talk about. But here's a typical story of the unready man. And the woman, I call her Lily, she was a very successful New York City art curator. She'd been in a 10-year partnership all through her 30s with a guy who I'll call Jack, who was still unready. So by the time she reached age 40, she left, she tried freezing her eggs, and the eggs were not good. They failed. It was a very sad story, and this is what she had to say. He was a professor and an academic, and I don't know if that has anything particularly to do with it, but I think he just couldn't commit. And I wanted to get married and have a kid, and he just couldn't get there in the same timeline while he was getting tenure. That's a big thing in America, getting tenure. You have to pass this tenure thing. He was like, I really want it. I see myself with kids playing ball. In theory, when I close my eyes, it's in the picture, but in reality, I'm totally paralyzed with fear. And so this is Lily. And so, I was sort of sick of clubbing the baby seal over the head. I went off the pill. He wouldn't sleep with me for 14 months. So 14 months, and then I was just over it. There comes a point when you can only take so much, and I had just, not consciously, just realized that and just had to leave. And the sad thing about Lily is that she was the only child of her dad. Her dad was a physician, and he had survived the Holocaust as a child. And so he really wanted Lily to have kids, and he really tried to help her to get her eggs frozen. And it didn't work. And basically, it kind of cut off the lineage, And I actually put that into the book, and my editor's like, whoa, you're kind of blaming Jack too much. You can't, But that was the story. She didn't have the kids. And I've been in touch with her, recently, and she's like, yeah, it's sort of hard to reread this, but that was her story. She's still not with anybody, by the way. So I ended up calling this thing the mating gap. These are women who desire what I call the 3 Ps. They want partnership. They want to experience pregnancy with their own eggs. They want to experience pregnancy, and they want to be parents. They want parenthood. But they lack the 3 E's. Eligible, educated, equal male partners, who one of my journalist friends said, you need to add 2 more E's. Men who are eager and enthusiastic to become fathers, because that seems to be a problem. And so there are these 4 partnership problems that women are facing. These unready guys, unready for marriage and children, the Peter Pans of the world, the men who are reluctant to partner up, they don't want to engage in hypergamy to a woman, they're intimidated. There were men who just exhibited bad behavior. I heard all sorts of things about, very sexist kinds of comments that men made. There was a lot of ageism. Women felt that as they got into their late 30s, men didn't want to even look at them anymore because men want to get a much younger woman as a partner so that they can be sure to have kids later. There was infidelity. There was substance abuse. There was a lot of stuff. So, there were reasons why, women said that they felt the partnership issue wasn't working for them. And so in the course of doing this study, women said they had encountered so many types of men, but rarely what they called their unicorns. They were looking for the rare unicorn. And they told me about all these different types. I have a chapter in the book. I have a table which is called 10 Types of Men, Women's Lexicon. And this is a condensed version, but these are the types. The alpha males, they want to be challenged by work, not their partners. The beta males, just floating along in life, they're portable. Feminist men who say about partnering, I'm not old-fashioned like that. Like, we're too cool to partner. I love this one because I interviewed a lot of women in Washington who'd been in the Foreign Service. They said foreign service men are Yale, pale, and male. Peter Pans, the men who never want to grow up. Polyamorous men, which are the guys, I call this new wine in old bottles, the men who are unfaithful. A fetish subculture, the bane of women's existence, the men who are like, oh, I have multiple committed relationships. Startup men in California, waiting to change the world, not to mate. Tech men, all the California, I said, you've got so many men in tech, can't you find a partner? Well, the odds are good, but the goods are odd. And then younger men, women had tried, and there's a whole thing in America about the cougars, the older women who go for younger guys. Some women had tried dating younger, and they said, oh, these younger men only know how to meet online and hook up with women. They want to have sex, but they don't want to have a relationship. So women wanted unicorns, equal men who want to marry and parent, but they said that pool doesn't exist. It's a pretty grim kind of table, but that is what women told me. And so there's a mating gap between men and women in America, but the question is there something more than just these differing gender norms and desires underlying this growing gap between men and women? And it is an educational gap that I want to talk about. I'm going to say gender-based educational disparities are really underlying this phenomenon. It's something that's been growing in the U.S. for decades now, but we don't talk about it in our country. And basically, women in the U.S. and around the world are absolutely rising into higher education. I think we should celebrate that. And men, we're not talking about this, men are losing ground, and this is really a cause for concern. In America, there are some scholars who are concerned about men losing ground, and I will say a few words about that. So, women in America are out-achieving men in education. These are just a couple of some quotes, one from the U.S. College Board. Girls now account for 60% of high school students with A or A+ averages. They're getting like GPAs of 4.5 on a 4-point scale. They're taking harder classes than boys do. Girls account for 55% of all students taking advanced placement or honors level classes in math and science. And this is an MIT study that was called Wayward Sons about American young men. And it says, although a significant minority of males continues to reach the highest echelons of achievement in education and labor markets, the median male is moving in the opposite direction. And so look at the numbers. First of all, this is a phenomenon that's been quietly happening for decades, where women are going to higher colleges and universities at higher numbers than men. So in 2015, a decade ago, there were 4 university-graduated women for every 3 men, a 4-to-3 ratio. In 2019, the statistics then showed that 28% more women than men were in higher education in universities. And we also call colleges, it's different from here, but college is also university in America. There was a huge decline of people entering university and college during the COVID pandemic, but 71% of the decline in admissions was attributable to men, not women. In 2024, last year, it was estimated that there were 38% more female university graduates than male graduates. And in the very near future, as soon as a decade from now, it's estimated that there will be 2 university-educated women in America for every 1 university-educated man, a 2-to-1 ratio, which is huge. And the result from a reproductive standpoint is now, in the prime reproductive years, your 20s and 30s, there are millions more women who are educated than there are American men. It's literally a lopsided number, okay? And the person who really pointed this out and was very influential to me is an economic journalist named John Berger, who wrote this book called Date-onomics, How Dating Became a Lopsided Numbers Game. And he had these conclusions. He just used U.S. Census data, looking at educational gaps around the U.S. And he says there is a university-educated man deficit in America and an oversupply of educated women. He called it a demographic time bomb for marriage-minded heterosexual women in the U.S. because these lopsided gender ratios incentivize the educated guys to play the field and delay marriage. These are the Peter Pans. These are the guys who aren't ready, but they could be educated, but they have so many educated women to choose from in dating apps that why should they settle down, right? And so he concluded highly educated women, the women at the top, really, in American society, if you will, are in trouble. They don't have the partners to partner with them. We know that less educated working class, working poor men in America are in trouble. We know that they're suffering in all sorts of ways. There's been a lot of sociological research. But we haven't really talked about how highly educated women have a problem, are suffering over this. And it's not just the U.S. I want to show you the global data that comes from the World Bank Gender Parity Index. Look at the numbers in Europe. You've got, I highlighted the UK because it's almost exactly the same as the U.S. You've got 27% more women in higher education than men. Very similar in the 20%. Italy, where Giulio's from, has got a 26% disparity. And then to look at Scandinavia, I find it so interesting because I think of Scandinavia as the most, gender progressive part of the world. But the gaps, the educational gaps, are really large. Denmark is about the same as the U.S. and the UK. But look at Iceland, 48% more women in higher education in Iceland than men. Sweden, 37%. Norway, 32%. And here's your region of the world, same thing. Australia, almost the same as the U.S. New Zealand, even more of a problem, 35% deficit. Hong Kong's on the lower side, but still there is a gap here. 11% more women in higher education in this country than men. And some higher, look at Thailand, has got 29%. So this is a global, the only part of the globe where you don't see these patterns is sub-Saharan Africa, okay? And there have been names given to this issue of these educated leftover women. In the US, there was a book published called Motherhood by a woman named Melanie Notkin. She said she was the generation right before egg freezing came into the world, and she wanted to be partnered, pregnant, and a parent, and it didn't happen. And she said, we were the women who wanted motherhood, but we ended up in otherhood. We are the other women, the ones who never found our partners. And the best thing that we can do is to be what she calls savvy aunties to our nieces and nephews. Find other ways to have children in our lives. In China, where you've got a huge gap, 16% more women in higher education than men in China now, it's been named, I mean, you've probably heard this term, the leftover women of China, who are sort of out-educated. They've educated themselves out of the marriage market. They have trouble finding a partner. And I want to tell you that we're going to look at East Asia in terms of egg freezing, and I'm going to make two kinds of statements here. You can do it in most countries, but being a mother on your own is banned. Single mothers by choice are not happening here in Asia, but some East Asian societies want egg freezing to happen so that women can become mothers. And I want to start with China because China is the one country where egg freezing is still banned. There have been very brave women who have brought lawsuits against certain hospitals. There are women pushing to have that ban overturned, but it is still banned in China, and it's causing single women to travel to other East Asian countries. The primary flow, the repro flow, is from People's Republic of China to Taiwan. Taiwan is the cheapest to do a cycle of egg freezing. Hong Kong, egg freezing is allowed, but it is high cost, higher than in Taiwan. And interestingly, Hong Kong has a 10-year storage limit. You can only store your eggs for a decade, and if you haven't used them, they have to be disposed of, or they can't be. Something has to happen to them, and so there's a limit on how long they can be frozen. And if you use your eggs, you can only use them within marriage. It's restricted to married couples. Japan allows it. It's now being subsidized by the Tokyo government to combat the ultra-low fertility in Japan. But again, husband's written consent is required to use the frozen eggs. Korea, it's allowed, being subsidized by the government in Seoul to combat fertility decline. Again, like Japan, husband's permission required. Singapore, it was banned until 2023. The ban was overturned. It's expensive to do it there. And again, the restriction to married couples. In Taiwan, it's allowed. 2 local governments are subsidizing it, but it's rationed. There are only 1,400 spots annually to get egg freezing with some government support. And again, this restriction to married couples. So all over East Asia, except for China, you can get your eggs frozen, but you can't decide to go on and be a mom on your own. You can't use donor sperm to make a baby on your own. You have to be married to use the eggs. But, Japan and Korea are saying our fertility is plummeted so much, we should get women to freeze their eggs to hold on to this chance of motherhood, to increase our total fertility rate. So the mating gap, just to recap, and to start again back in the US, look at that as a stunning statistic that about half of all American women between the ages of 20 and 44 do not have biological children. Women are just not reproducing like they used to. And it's true that in the US and in many countries, there are a group of women, educated women, who very much want to become mothers. They want partnership, pregnancy, and parenthood, but they're unable to find these eligible, educated, equal partners. And so what do you do when you're in your mid to late 30s? You're facing an age-related fertility decline, the fertility cliff of age 37. Well, women are turning to egg freezing. They're literally doing it while most of them are waiting for a mate, and that mate may or may not materialize. Women are hoping that in the next 5 years they can find a partner. So egg freezing, I'm going to use the 2 verbs that I prefer. It preserves and extends fertility during what I call the reproductive waithood period, when women are literally waiting, not by choice. They're kind of waiting around, hoping to find somebody, to find a partner. And egg freezing, it's a Band-Aid solution. It's a very costly technological concession to sort of bridge this gap for women who are kind of stuck in reproductive suspension. It's a stopgap measure. It's a technological fix, but it can't really address the underlying global social problem of educational differences and gender differences that seem to be growing around the globe. You know, women always say, like, I feel so alone. I felt like I was the only person, you know, who was facing this, like there's something wrong with me. It's like, oh no, it's you and thousands of other women, millions of other women. This is a social problem, not an individual one. But I had a woman in my study, she quipped, she said, you know, until we fix men, egg freezing cannot fix men, whatever that means. And I just want to say that we need to have scholars who really talk to men. We need to understand men's perspectives on all of this, on their education, why they're not going to college and university, what they think about partnership, what they think about reproduction. I mean, it takes men and women to reproduce, and why is it that a lot of men don't want to do reproduction anymore? But I do want to sort of end on a happy note to say that egg freezing really does work for some women who use it. And perhaps those women are the ones who are rethinking mating altogether. And I want to share this story of a woman I call Hannah. This is a term, mixed collar mating, which was introduced by my colleague John Berger, and which I picked up in my book. But Hannah was highly educated. She was an Ivy League educated lawyer. She had a good experience with egg freezing. She froze 32 eggs. And then she went on a transnational bike tour that took about 4 months. She met a guy, I call him Lucas. He was a Western firefighter. We have had a lot of fires in California and the Western states, so that's what he did for a living. And they hit it off on the bike tour, and when they came back to the States, he and his puppy moved across country, and I have been in recent touch with Hannah 10 years on. They have 2 kids. They had the first one naturally by surprise, but the second one, she used the frozen eggs, and they have a frozen egg baby. And she was wildly enthusiastic about the whole thing. She said, my net on the experience was it's so emotionally empowering, right? Because I went from a state of sort of panicked that I was probably like in denial of and trying desperately not to have, to all of a sudden I'm in control of the situation. I had a lot of time as I went through both the egg freezing and everything associated with it and the training for the trip to really reflect on what I wanted and who I was and what I was looking for. I think having the space and the time on this bike trip to really get to know who someone was a real privilege. He's a sort of extraordinarily patient and generous and brave man, and it was just easy then to sort of trust him, and it was really quite special. It was really neat. He's a good guy. He's a really good guy. So there are good men out there, you know, and I personally believe there are, and I write about a lot of them in the book too, the friends, the brothers, the dads, you know, even ex-partners who were good to these women. But at any rate, the interesting part for her, she was very honest about it. She said, you know, for me, the big thing that I had to think through when I got back to the U.S. and I was thinking about him is, you know, he comes from a different background than I do. All of my friends went to Harvard and Yale and Princeton. They're all lawyers. What are my friends going to think of him? Because he's like a firefighter and, you know, he comes from the West. He's a different kind of guy. She was worried about it, and she said she had to think about it and to sort of get over it. Like, what's wrong with being somebody who's not the same educational or class that I'm in? And she was so happy. Her friends loved him because he was a good guy. And they have been together for a decade, and they have 2 kids. So in my book, I try to show a variety of stories of the ones that didn't find a man, the ones who didn't find a partner and decided to become a single mother by choice and have a baby. Some very happy stories of that. Some women who found a partner used their frozen eggs and none of the eggs worked, which does happen. You know, so I tried to show the spectrum of things that can happen in egg freezing. So at the end of when I talk to women, I often would say, like, at the end of the day, how do you feel about it now that you've done it? And there was this outpouring of positivity. More than 90% of women, 93% of women in my study had at least one good thing to say about their experience, and a lot of them had multiple things to say. There were sort of 11 categories of how it made women feel that they had benefited. It gave them more choices, reproductive choices and options. Like Hannah said, it gave her a feeling of control, that she could make a decision about this. Empowerment. She used power, empowering, and so many women use that word. I felt empowered. It was empowering. Women often did use the fertility insurance policy language that the clinics try to promote, like, oh, I just bought myself an insurance policy. I feel safe now. Women said, it prevents me from feeling regret. What if I, 5 years from now, I don't have a child? It's still, I feel like I did everything I could, given the circumstances I was in, so I don't have to feel regret for not doing it. Huge psychological relief. Women just said, oh my God, it took the pressure off my shoulders. I'm not so panicked as I was. I can sit there on a date now and not think, not have to worry, is he going to be my future baby daddy? It gave a freedom for relationships that they didn't feel before. And women often said, like, this is something I did to invest in myself. I used my own money. I invested in myself. It gave me a feeling of success, that this is going to be successful for me. And I feel optimistic about this new technology, a lot of pro-technology feeling. Ultimately, the timing mattered. Women say, this is the way I can add some time to my reproductive life that I might not have otherwise, and that's really important. It buys time. It buys time until you can find your perfect soulmate. But there's so many questions, and just to go through them, how many frozen eggs do women need? What's going to be good enough? Women are often told, you need to try to get 20, and they struggle to try to get 20 eggs. They go through 2, 3, sometimes 4 cycles trying to get that magic number. And the older you get, you probably need actually a lot more than 20 eggs to try to get a baby out of it. So as egg quality and quantity declines with age, it may be that you need even more than 20 eggs to be successful. Will women return to use their frozen eggs is an interesting question. So far, in the US studies, it's anywhere between 0% returning to 38%. It's not a large number. Globally, only about 12% of women have returned to use their eggs. And so what does that mean? It could mean that women don't need to use their eggs because they found a partner and went on and had children. But most of the studies that have been done on return show that the reason women are not coming back is they didn't find a partner and they did not want a parent on their own. They said they only wanted to be a parent if they could do it in a partnership. So there are going to be a lot of frozen eggs sitting around unless those numbers increase. Will frozen eggs lead to future children? Well, as I showed you in Hannah's story, they already are. People are using their frozen eggs, and there are frozen egg babies being born. Will the technology kind of normalize? I'm going to say that early on, when it just came into the world, there was a lot of stigma about egg freezing. Now in the US, every young woman has heard of egg freezing. There's a lot of marketing through social media about egg freezing to younger and younger women. I found in my study that friend groups were all talking about it, often freezing together, or there was often one woman who was the first one, the bellwether woman would do it, and then her friends would follow suit. So friendship groups egg freezing together. Will younger women freeze their eggs? There are clinics telling women in their 20s that they should freeze their eggs, which I do not believe is the right approach. I think women should start thinking about it when they're in their early 30s if they don't have a partner. But we know that demand for egg freezing the age is declining. Younger and younger women are beginning to freeze their eggs. Will women use their frozen eggs to become single mothers by choice? Well, there were several in my study who had done that. Anytime I've talked about egg freezing in Europe, in Western Europe, this is a trend. They go, oh yeah, women here are just doing it on their own. They're just saying, forget the partner. I'm going to use the eggs and donor sperm. And, Australia, New Zealand, it's happening in those kinds of places. And this is the thing that's really banned in Asia. Women can freeze their eggs, but they can only use them once partnered and married, actually. Will insurance eventually cover egg freezing so that women don't have to have that huge outlay of money on their own? Yes, there are already egg freezing, they're called fertility benefits, in almost 20% of big Fortune 500 companies. And so increasingly, companies are covering egg freezing, which some feminists find controversial. They're saying, well, that means that companies are encouraging women to put off their childbearing. And that's not what I learned in my study. There were women in my study who fought to get insurance coverage in their companies. They felt very discriminated against as single women. And there's only one state, one country that I know of in the world that will provide coverage for egg freezing. It's France. but it's called a freeze and share program. If you freeze your eggs, you must give some of your eggs away because they have a donor egg shortage in France, and so they're insisting that those who freeze must donate as well. And there's a lot of other sort of restrictions on that program. Will egg freezing globalize over time? It has globalized. We know probably that number is low now. There are probably well over 60 nations around the world performing egg freezing, because as long as you have an IVF clinic or an IVF sector in a country, they'll figure out how to do vitrification. The important thing is that fast freezing technology called vitrification, and more countries are able to do that. What's going to happen to millions of stored eggs over time? In the US, clinics make women sign consent forms saying, when you reach the age of, what are you going to do with your frozen eggs? And in America, it's when you reach the age of menopause, which is 50, 51, 52. That's when the clinics cut off use of frozen eggs. You can use those eggs until you reach the age of menopause, and they give 3 choices. You can dispose of the eggs, have the eggs disposed of. You can donate them to research, and that was the number 1 choice. Women say, I like stem cell research. I'd like my eggs to be donated to research. Or you can donate to other people. And some women chose to do that to specific people in their lives. Like, I'm going to leave my eggs to my sister or to my cousin or to my best friend or to my gay friends who really need, gay male couples who really need frozen eggs. So interesting what women thought they wanted to do if they weren't going to use their own eggs. So in America, when egg freezing came out, it was called a reproductive revolution. Like, this was going to be the next big thing, almost like the birth control pill. That was the way egg freezing was being described. My feeling is that it's definitely not a reproductive revolution, mainly because it is way too expensive to be revolutionary. Very few people can use this technology. It is going to be restricted to the highest echelon of wage earners in America. And I find that to be a real problem in speaking, about reproductive justice, that there are many women who would like to be able to freeze their eggs but will not be able to because they will never be able to afford it. And so, who knows, in the future, will it become a much more common and more accessible technology? Maybe, but really only time's going to tell. And I say thank you. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you, Marcia. Fascinating talk, and gives a lot to think about. So I think there are a few questions. Should we take a break? Should we go for questions right away? Okay. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. It's a fascinating seminar, and I have a question. When you mentioned that most of those women, they only wanted to get pregnant in a partnership. I wonder why. Is there a cultural institution norm mechanism behind it? Because hypothetically, if they want to be a mother, they could. There's other ways. They're cheaper, especially in a very flexible dating culture in the U.S. It reminds me of some TV dramas like the Sex and the City, Miranda.
There are plenty of those kind of
Miranda.
shows.
She's basically a model of the single motherhood, and also there's another Japanese movie. It also showed some kind of utopian picture for women. There was this very successful singer, and she wanted to have a baby, and she didn't find the she tried to find the one she really loved, but it turns out that that man couldn't get pregnant. Reproduce. Then she actually found some other ways. I guess the TV drama implied that she actually found her gay friend to somehow make a solution. So there's a lot of practical way for them to actually become mother. So why do they have not decided to choose these ways, especially when the this technology is quite risky and very expensive. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. I think it is. I think single motherhood by choice is the growing social phenomenon in parts of the world where it's allowed for women to, reproduce on their own, as it were, to use donor sperm. And in my study, I talked a lot to women about it. It always came up. And for most women, it was plan B. Plan B is just to use their frozen eggs and get donor sperm. And, women said they wanted to experience pregnancy, and they ideally wanted to use their own eggs to experience pregnancy. And so, some women went ahead and did it. But what I found in my study, there were women who'd already done it. I have several examples of that in the book. There were women who were planning to do it, but to have a child on your own, especially if you're living in a big, expensive city, it's expensive. Not only, the child care, just the cost of it. There were a lot of women who were trying to figure out, can I do it? Given my job, given where I live, given child care. There are waiting lists to get into child care in America. So they were thinking about it. And for those who are very serious about it, they often made very pragmatic decisions to move back to places to be closer to their parents or their siblings so that they could get some support. There were women just trying to figure out, do I have the financial, wherewithal to be able to do this on my own? So those who were sort of in the planning stage. And then there were women, plenty of them, who said culturally, religiously, like I grew up in a Catholic family, or I grew up in a Muslim family, or I'm just from culturally, in my family, there's like no way it would just be, really not acceptable in my community to be, an out of wedlock mother. That's the old-fashioned word for it. So some said like, no, I can't do it for whatever reason. Interestingly, I had so many Asian American women in my study, both ones from South Asia and ones from East Asia. The South Asian women, the one whose parents, the Indian American women in my study, often their moms were like, got to the point where the mothers were like, just forget about the partner. It's obvious you're not going to find one. I want grandchildren. And those women were so shocked that their own parents were telling them, we'd rather just get the grandchildren, forget the son-in-law. So that was interesting. But a lot of studies show that women just never imagined themselves, becoming a mom without a partner. And we need to really ask, what does partnership offer heterosexual women? We're talking about women who are straight, they want to be with a straight guy. And, it's about love, it's about sex, it's about companionship, it's about doing things together, it's about having the traditional heteronormative nuclear family. And for a lot of women, that dream is hard to give up, and so I'll also say that adoption has become more and more and more difficult in America. Transnational adoption, which is questionable ethically anyhow, has really, really gone, down in numbers in America. It's very hard to adopt babies out of the U.S. adoption system. And there are lots of restrictions in fostering, too. So it's not easy. A lot of people in America are willing to adopt, but it's difficult. It can actually be more expensive in some ways than going through an assisted reproductive technology. So I'm with you. I do believe there are a lot of women open to the idea of doing it on their own, but it's hard for a variety of reasons. And that's really, so I'm going to say it's only going to be women who've got substantial support and money who are going to be able to pull it off. There's a couple other hands.
Okay, I have one short question, one slightly longer question.
Okay,
so
sure.
the shorter question is for the women who making plans with the eggs that perhaps they don't use, have any of them considered selling? Because I know that there's a market for eggs, I guess mostly harvested from younger women.
Yes.
And you mentioned the French donation thing. So that's the quick question. And the second question...
Can I answer that one first,
Yeah,
just
sure.
so I won't forget?
Yeah.
In the initial enthusiasm for egg freezing, there was a whole lot of discussion about, yay, we'll have so many frozen eggs once egg freezing comes into the world. This will be the solution to our egg donor shortage. That was the sort of thinking, like, oh, we're going to have all of these eggs, but not good eggs. The age of egg freezing is so high around the world. Women are doing this, like, it takes them a while to get there, and they're already in their mid to late 30s in most countries by the time they get to it. And women themselves, actually there were a few in my study who said, I'm willing to donate, but they don't qualify as a donor because their egg quality is not considered to be good. And even I had a couple of younger women in my study, like the youngest age was 29 in my study, and there was one young woman who she got 19 eggs. She's like, that's way more than I need. She asked her doctor, can I give some of these away? She was going to offer them, and they were like, hold on, you need to save those 19 frozen eggs because you don't know how they're going to turn out. So no, not a single person said anything about selling. They did make jokes about donating their eggs, but saying, no one wants my old eggs, So no, so far it hasn't become a market because of the age factor and so forth. But in France, they're doing freeze and share, and I know that in the UK, they have freeze and share programs too, to try to do something about the egg donor shortage, because there is that problem. So yeah, the next question.
Okay. I was just wondering how your research fits in with the trope of childless cat ladies, the way that the right wing is trying to be very pro-natalist, but at the same time so anyway, I was wondering if you could speak to that.
I know, actually, somebody asked me that in an interview, like, what do you think is this about the childless cat ladies of the world? First of all, I love cats, okay? And I was a childless cat lady, so that remark obviously got a very negative reaction among a lot of women. But, we're talking about women who, there are women, for example, my niece is a childless cat lady by choice. She does not want to have children. My own daughter, who's 26 going on 27, is pretty sure she doesn't want to have children. So that is a growing phenomenon. To talk about new generation, that is absolutely a new phenomenon that young people are saying, no, I choose not to have children. The egg freezing population, you're not going to do egg freezing, have this done to your body and spend all that money unless you want to be a mom, or at least are thinking that it's something you think you want to do. You wouldn't go through it. And so these are women who wish that they weren't childless. They wish that they were partnered. And I just think the whole notion is just so unfair. This problem is, women didn't make this problem. This isn't in their individual control. This is a social problem. The men need to step it up, basically. We should tell J.D. Vance that, by the way. Like, you men need to step it up. I am so appalled that he's from Yale. I'm sorry to say. Yale has produced some bad ones, I have to say. Some in the Supreme Court, some in anyway. But yeah, that is an interesting thing about, who are these women? What is this generation of women? Yeah. Yeah, there's some other studies, like well before my own, where they did retrospective interviews with women who had made it into high levels of American business culture, high levels of childlessness among that group of women. These were like executive women. But guess what? They didn't want to be childless. They just hadn't been able to get partnered, They outsmarted and intimidated men, and so nobody, wanted to marry them. And it was a very sad finding, high levels of childlessness that was not there by choice, right? I thought there was another hand back there. Yeah, thanks.
First of all, thank you very much for the amazing presentation. I have so many questions. I wrote them down on my head, but I think I'll just ask one. Okay. As mentioned before, right wing, it's been on the rise in the US and Europe as well. I'm actually a bit scared about women's rights. Yes. Do you think that this technology might be negatively impacted by this rise? And if they do start changing policies, they kind of already did in the US, about women's reproductive rights. So what would be the future maybe for this? Yeah,
that's a really good question. We are in a very bad moment politically, in my view, and there have been major attacks on all sorts of reproductive rights, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and with regard to assisted reproductive technologies, there was an attempt to say that all frozen embryos are human life, and therefore they can't be destroyed, and therefore if you are an IVF clinic who destroys human embryos, you will be, it would be negligent manslaughter. You know, it would be killing these innocent embryos. And so there's already been a lot of discussion about, you know, banning certain aspects, you know, embryo freezing, which has been such an important technology for people going through IVF. Eggs are a little different because it's not life, right? It's just one of the gametes. And I actually interviewed women in my study who were pious. They came from Catholic families where, you know, embryos are considered to be, you know, sanctified. They're sacred. If you believe that they're human life, you know, what are you going to do with an embryo? And women were glad that they were just freezing their eggs and not embryos. So I don't think this is the first thing that's going to be attacked, but it is in the larger scope of things. There's been a lot of discussion about assisted reproductive technologies in our political arena in ways that we've never seen before. And IVF clinics have been trying to face some of these issues, especially in this, you know, this whole issue about embryos and what to do with them. So yeah, that's. Is there another question you wanted to ask of your 5 questions?
I have a few, but maybe somebody else. Okay, then I'll just go on. So you actually mentioned the word stigma, and I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. I was wondering if the women you interviewed faced or felt that there was a lot of stigma around cryo-freezing, and could that maybe be one of the causes why the different ethnicities I'm forgetting my English, sorry. Yeah. Why the amount was so different of people who were using the service.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's I have a chapter that talks about overrepresentation of some groups and underrepresentation of other groups. Overrepresentation was Asian American women and Jewish American women. And so I looked at that. Guess what? Asian American women and Jewish American women are the most educated groups of people in American society. Both traditions, let's say, that value education highly, and so it's like, surprise, surprise, you've got all these very educated Asian American and Jewish American women, and they're having trouble finding partners. So those were the overrepresented groups. Underrepresented were what we call underrepresented minorities, like there were less African American, Latina American, and no indigenous, no Native American people were in my study. And I talked to some very powerful voices, women in my study, who really talked about that. You know, I had Black women in my study who were like, we need to make this a technology that Black women can access, know about, and have part of their reproductive choice. You know, this is a reproductive justice issue for Black women. Black women are the ones who came up with the notion of reproductive justice, the right to have children, the right not to have children, and the right to parent children in safe, healthy, dignified environments. And it is a justice issue. Like, why don't many people, you know, especially people of color, have access? So there were strong feelings about that something needed to be done to bring the cost of this technology down, to have insurance cover it so that people could actually get access to it. So there was that. And also African American women in particular, and Latina women who were raised, most Latina women were raised Catholic, and most Black women were raised in the sort of Southern Baptist, African American Methodist, you know, Southern African American religious traditions, where it was stigmatized to not be partnered. You know, there were like the notions like you need to do this within a partnership, within marriage. And egg freezing for a woman to do it on her own, and especially for Catholics, like that's against nature, that's against conception, the way it's supposed to be done. So yeah, for women who came from those traditions, that concerned them. And we talked about that. I mean, I will tell you, a lot of younger people in America, even if they were raised in a religious tradition, are not practicing. That was what I found. Like, most of the women in my study, the majority had been raised Catholic, but they weren't practicing anymore. So there's been a secularization of the educated younger generation in America, but those issues were of concern to them. And then just to talk about stigma, another form of stigma, women felt so stigmatized being single, unpartnered, and going into the IVF clinic. Because IVF clinics are very married spaces. You know, people are in there. Women had all sorts of comments, like I'd go in there and I'd see all these sparkling wedding rings on women's fingers, and the men are sitting there cuddling them. And here I am after giving myself 20 shots and I'm by myself. Women talked about just weeping, you know, that they wept on the examination table. The clinics were sometimes so insensitive to these single women coming in. They had to sign consent forms and like, okay, we've given you the injection slips on how to do the injections so that your partner, so your husband can give you the injections. And then the woman would say, well, I don't have a partner. Oh, no partner? Well, we need to cross that out. I mean, it was really insensitive. They were not prepared for this new population of single women. So I have a whole huge chart in my book on what would patient-centered egg freezing look like. And there were all sorts of things women said about how it should be made better. You know, so they felt really lonely and really stigmatized as the unmarried woman going into an IVF clinic, and very isolated. It was not a good feeling. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
No.
Oh,
yeah. So I have a couple of questions. So one is on you mentioned that all the women you talked to, most of them went through periods of online dating, and I was wondering whether there was maybe something specific about online dating that was at the basis of this problem, of this mating app. I was wondering if there's something really about the technology, about that mode, that makes it quite specific. You know, that kind of worsens the issue. Yeah. This is one question. Unrelated question, another one is this technology is very expensive, and so it's very few people can afford it. And I know there's been quite a few, even feminist critiques of this technology because it's quite elitist. You know, not many people can afford it. I was wondering, if you can talk a bit about those critiques and what they say, how and what people think about them.
Yeah. So first on the online dating, you know, I have a daughter who's engaged in online dating, and she calls it a nightmare. You know, there's a lot of critique of online dating that it's just created actually things that aren't really good between men and women anymore. You know, this just sort of playing, you know, swiping on people based on what they look like and so forth. Every woman in my study had engaged in it. I mean, it is omnipresent as part of the way people meet each other now. And almost every woman had some critique of it. You know, it hadn't worked for them, or it was, just time-consuming. And women said that they had to dumb themselves down on their profiles. That if they put, like, where they had gone to college or what their degrees were, that it just eliminated men from wanting to date them. And so women were getting advice from their girlfriends like, take that off. Don't put that you went to Harvard, you know. The kind of information you had to fill out on these online, these dating mechanisms. So there was a big feeling that online dating wasn't working. And so women, it was an interesting term. Women said, I'd much rather meet someone organically. And I didn't quite know what that meant. Organically just means person to person, like meeting them in person. And so people trying to set them up in the old-fashioned ways. You know, I got set up with my husband because somebody set us up. One of my students actually set us up. So there was a lot of discussion about just the online dating thing has changed civilities between men and women. There's a lot of bad stuff. People ghost each other. You know, I heard about all of that stuff in my study. A lot of unhappy things, you know, in online dating. I can tell you, like, in the first chapter, I have a woman's story at the head of each chapter. And in chapter 1, I talk about a woman, I think I called her Clarissa, living in Washington, D.C. She was an economist, an international economist. She loved her work, and she had traveled a lot. She was, had a really interesting, and she loved her job. And she said, it's the one thing in my life that I really love, but I can't find, she used the term, this is an eternal mystery. I don't know why I can't meet anybody. And she said, there's this guy, I met him online. He, like me, he speaks more than one language. A lot of Americans are monolingual, you know. He actually speaks more than one language. And, but the weird thing is I thought we were going to have a date. And then for 3 weeks, I didn't hear anything from him. You know, he kind of disappeared. I thought he was ghosting me, but he's popped up again. And so I guess I have a date with him. I mean, it was that sort of unsure, And probably he found somebody else that he was dating online and went off with her. And then when that didn't quite work out, he was back to the one I was talking to. I mean, that's the kind of thing that happens now with online dating. It's a misery making for a lot of women. The other question was on the feminist critiques. Yeah, I have in chapter 7, I sort of looked at the feminist view of egg freezing because there has been a lot of feminist discussion about it. And there's only one of 4 kind of feminist perspectives that you would say is like pro-technology, supports this technology. Basically, I would call that the neoliberal feminist view of egg freezing, which is, it's a new technology. We've had a lot of other new technologies come into reproduction, and this helps give women other choices, other options. And I would say a lot of women really felt that. They felt like, gosh, I'm so glad I'm in the era where this is a new option for me. So there's that, it's just another technology. It's going to help women. But then the first major critique, feminist critique, happened when big companies like Google, Apple, Facebook started subsidizing it very early on. Like in 2013, they started subsidizing egg freezing for their employees. And there was an immediate assumption that they were doing this to try to make women just stay in the workforce, never have children. They saw it as an anti-childbearing kind of stance. So they just want their workers to work 70, 100 hours a week, never have kids. They want them to put off childbearing. And I talked to so many women in tech who were like, we fought for that in our companies, And why did they fight for it? What made them mad? These big Fortune 500 companies were already funding IVF for married women. If you were a married employee of the company and you could prove that you were infertile, which is you could prove that you've been trying to get pregnant for 1 year of unprotected sexual intercourse, but you couldn't get pregnant, then you had an infertility diagnosis, and then you could get your company to pay for your IVF, which is very expensive. So these women in tech who are saying, my colleague gets to go off and do 4 cycles of paid IVF on our company. I'm trying to prevent myself from being infertile, but I can't prove I am infertile because I haven't had 12 months of unprotected sexual intercourse with anybody. And so I'm being discriminated against because I'm single. And guess who else is being discriminated against? Lesbian women. They're not having 12 months of unprotected sexual intercourse. So they really argued differently than the feminist critique, which was very interesting. So that was one of the critiques, kind of the structural, like women need other ways to have work-life balance. This isn't the right thing to do. At any rate, more and more companies are subsidizing egg freezing. Then there's the feminist critique that I really agree with, which is the intersectional feminist critique. That intersectionality, again, it comes from Black feminist theorists. It's like certain groups of women are more oppressed than others, women of color, women who are poor. They have multiple stakes going against them. And this is just a technology that's going to privilege elite people, mostly white women, and a lot of women who could use the technology, could benefit from it, will never get access to it, and based on their various statuses and different forms of oppression. So I do abide by that. I think the accessibility issue is huge. As you said, it's too expensive. And then the final critique, which I don't really agree with, I'm a personally, I don't go around promoting egg freezing, but I do think we need to understand it, and we need to understand why people want to use it. But there's a certain group of feminists who are just sort of anti-technology. I call them the Luddite feminists. They've been around for a very long time, since the beginning of IVF. The 2 groups that opposed IVF, radically opposed IVF, were religious people and feminists who said, this is just another intervention into women's bodies. This is telling women that they have to be mothers. This is just anti-woman to have IVF coming into the world. And they were very vocal, and a group of them created an organization called FinRage. It was called FinRage back in the IVF days. And there's still a group of feminists like that who just are sort of anti-technology. I mean, it's not an easy technology, and it's expensive, so I too think, that's not great. And I don't think we should be promoting it for women in their 20s. By the way, if any of you are in your 20s, I have a 26-year-old daughter. If she wanted to have children in the future, I would not want my 26-year-old daughter to freeze her eggs. The only time I think it kind of makes sense in thinking is if you reach your early 30s, you really know you want to have children. You really don't have any idea of where you're going to find a partner. Or you're really thinking about, do I want to freeze eggs and maybe be a single mother by choice? Then the time to do it is in the early 30s. That's my feeling. But I don't think it's a technology. That's why I don't think it's a reproductive revolution. I don't think it's going to be widespread for people in their 20s. And I don't think women in their 20s should be running to the IVF clinic to freeze their eggs. So that's my feeling about, you know, the feminist perspectives and my own feeling about it. I'm not like, yay, egg freezing, but I understand why all these women wanted to do it. And frankly, the one thing I do really feel strongly about, I myself was a person who always wanted to be a mother. I used to babysit a lot when I was a teen. I love children. I love little children. I love babies. I knew personally I needed to have children one way or another. And I was really clear on that. And I know I've studied infertility for like 4 decades. And when you want children and you can't have children for whatever reason, it is heartbreaking. It's emotionally painful and heartbreaking. So if this is a technology that in some way helps people to have children because in their hearts they really feel that they need to be parents, like, then my feeling is it's good for those people. I absolutely understand and empathize with anybody who has their reproduction barred because of a medical condition or because they can't find a partner. And so that's my feeling about it. It's like I'm glad that egg freezing has entered the world because it can help overcome that, you know, great sorrow that people have if they can't have the children that they want so much. So, yeah.
Any other final questions? Okay, well, in that case, you can leave it there. And yeah, thanks. Thank you, Marcia, for this.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions. Those were great questions. Thank you.